This chord progression is in the key of C major. I want you to notice if anything seems like it doesn't belong. I used this chord progression in another one of my videos, and a lot of people commented with the question, how can this be in the key of C major but use black keys? People refer to this as the creep chord progression because it was used in a different key in the Radiohead song Creep, and lots of other popular songs since then. And it's a great example of a straightforward, commonly used chord progression that uses non-diatonic chords. In this video, I want to explain that term, non-diatonic, and then look at the two most common sources of non-diatonic chords in pop music, both of which are used in this chord progression. First, what does non-diatonic mean? Well, in this case, we're in the key of C major, which is our only major scale that just uses white keys. And yet two of the chords, this E major chord and then later this F minor chord, use a black key. And we would call this black key non-diatonic. Diatonic means belonging to the notes of a major scale. So non-diatonic means any note that doesn't belong in the major scale for the key of a piece. And if you're in the key of C major, all of your non-diatonic notes are going to be black keys. But if you're in another key, some of your non-diatonic notes might be white keys. And D flat major, for example, actually only has white keys as its non-diatonic notes. And if that last bit about other keys, D flat major, doesn't make sense to you, you probably need to practice your major scales. And you're welcome to grab my free one-page guide to the shapes of all 12 major scales. Okay, so why can we use black keys in a piece that's in C major? Wouldn't that mean that it's just in a different key? And I love this question because it kind of gets to the core of what it means to be in a key. Being in a certain key for a piece of music has more to do with just using that set of 7 notes. It also has to do with a sense of tension and resolution. When we come to the one or the one chord in a piece of music, that should sound like the most resolved place. And actually, non-diatonic notes get used all over the place in lots of styles of music without disturbing our sense of resolution on the one chord. Actually, one of my favorite examples of this is the song Do Re Mi from The Sound of Music. That song is being used in the plot of that musical to teach the 7 notes of a major scale, right? Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. Those are just solfege syllables, classic music education syllables to teach the 7 notes of a major scale. And yet, check it out, the second half of that melody uses a ton of non-diatonic notes. So when it gets to the part where it goes, right there we use this, right? There we use both of these, and then here we go. So we use that one. We've ended up using all 3 of these non-diatonic notes within that melody. Richard Rodgers was very sneaky. I'm not sure if he was even doing that on purpose as kind of a joke, but I love it. It works because we're never landing strongly on one of those notes at the top of the melody, and those notes at the top of the melody are where they're teaching the new syllables, right? So, da 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 da, la ya da 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 da, ti da 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 da. So it's very sneaky. These non-diatonic notes are getting included. And the reason they work within that melody is not only that they're like part of these melodic phrases leading upwards, but also that they're related to what's happening in the harmony in the song in those spots. It's part of a sequence of secondary dominance. So this is a good transition to talking about secondary dominance, one of our first 2 big ideas for how you can introduce non-diatonic chords into very tonal, traditional sounding music. And let's start by looking at what I feel is a secondary dominant in this creep chord progression. So in the creep chord progression, we start on 1, then we go to 3, then 4, and then 4 minor. Remember, though, that 3 should be a minor chord if it's diatonic, right? If we're only using notes from the C major scale, the 3 chord is always going to be a minor chord so that this third note of the chord belongs in the C major scale. We've used a non-diatonic chord when we play the 3 chord as a major chord. And a lot of the time, the way that we analyze a 3 major chord in a major key is not as 3, but as 5 of 6. This is the idea of a secondary dominant. And you might have heard of this idea before. With a secondary dominant, we are using the 5 chord, otherwise known as the dominant chord, for a chord other than the key of the song. So if we're just staying in the key of C, our dominant chord would be G. That's our 5 chord. And the dominant to tonic, or 5-to-1 resolution, is the strongest cadence. It's the strongest resolution in classical music. With a secondary dominant, we're using that same cadence. We're using that same resolution, but the chord we're resolving to is not the 1 chord. So in this case, a lot of times E major in the key of C gets used to resolve to A minor. Because in the key of A minor, E is the dominant. E is the 5 of A minor. So we would call it 5 of 6, because A minor is the 6th chord in the key of C major. And if any of these numbers aren't making sense, I have other videos on the concept of using numbers in music. It can be very quickly explained that we're just numbering these notes and chords by the major scale. So here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 within the major scale. And if you build a chord starting on the 4, for example, that's the 4 chord. Okay, so secondary dominants are very commonly used in many styles of music. And this is most often a good explanation of what's happening if, for example, you see the 2 chord played as a major chord or a dominant 7 chord. Same with the 3 chord played as a major or dominant 7 chord, or the 6 chord played as a major or dominant 7 chord. And you notice that with all of those, these are the chords within a major key that are supposed to be played as minor chords. So often we will change them, we will raise them into major chords. Sometimes we'll also add the dominant 7. And usually when that happens, they're going to be followed by the chord of which they are the 5. So 2 dominant 7 is often followed by 5. 3 dominant 7 is often followed by 6. And 6 dominant 7 is often followed by 2. And in that situation, all of these chords are acting formally the way they're supposed to as secondary dominants. Now, there are a lot of situations where they kind of use that sound and that logic without actually going to the chord they're supposed to go to. And in this creep chord progression, this is a good example of that. A lot of times the 3 chord, instead of going straight to 6, will go to 4. And you notice that the 6 chord and the 4 chord are almost identical. So the sound of the resolution is very similar. And what you notice they have in common is that in both cases, these voices are resolving to the same place. And especially this voice, here's our non-diatonic note. That's the one that really matters. It really sticks out. It doesn't make sense in the key of C, but it does make sense in the key of A. And that's because it resolves really strongly, really well, up to A. So very often, songwriters like to use this. 3 as a major chord, resolving upward into 4, and you get this really nice resolution of this note. It's the raised 5th within the key, resolving upward to the 6th in the key. Now, as we keep going through the creep chord progression, we get to another chord that uses that same non-diatonic note, but it's going to resolve it in a different direction. And because that note is resolving in a different direction, this chord is actually coming from a whole other family of chords that you will start to recognize as you learn lots of music in different styles. And we would call these borrowed chords. So this is where we get to the F minor chord at the end of the chord progression, and it resolves down to C. So this voice, this non-diatonic note, is resolving down to the 5th of the C major chord. We call this a borrowed chord because although it doesn't make sense in the key of C major, it does make sense in the key of C minor. So borrowed chords are borrowing a chord from the parallel minor key. If we're in the key of C major, our parallel minor is just going to be C minor. And C minor has a bunch of chords that don't belong in the key of C major. A really favorite one of songwriters is this 4 minor chord. And you can hear that it sounds more like it belongs to a minor key. It has this darker sound to it. And it resolves so nicely back to the 1 major chord. I would say that this use of it, going from the 4 chord to the 4 minor chord to the 1 chord, is by far the most common use of it, especially in like singer-songwriter music. But it's used a lot in Great American Songbook songs as well, like jazz standards. And it has this really beautiful bittersweet sound to it. And I said it's part of a bigger family of chords. In jazz standards especially, there's a whole bunch of chords that use that same resolution of this note down onto the 5th of the 1 chord. But these other chords just have different bass notes. So 2 half diminished 7 is used a lot. Also flat 7 dominant. That would be a B flat dominant 9 or B flat dominant 7 in the key of C. That also basically resolves in the same way. And then, sometimes you'll have a 4 minor chord or a 4 minor major 7 or 4 minor 6 chord with that flat 6 note actually in the bass. And then that often will resolve down to the 5th of the 1 chord. So I think of all of those chords as kind of part of the same family, where these 3 notes are going to be included, and especially important is this voice resolving down. That voice, that either you could think of it as a raised 5th or a lowered 6th, that's kind of the money note here. It's one of my favorite and many songwriters' favorites non-diatonic notes, and it's going to act a little differently depending on whether you want to resolve it upwards or resolve it downwards. And in terms of the theory of it, that resolution, are we going up or are we going down, that's going to basically determine whether the best explanation of the note or the chord is a secondary dominant or a borrowed chord. And one last note on these borrowed chords. Students often ask, what scale could I use against that borrowed chord? And it would make sense just to use that parallel minor scale. So like C minor against that 4 minor chord. And that's really lovely. You can also use kind of a mixture of the minor and the major scale against that chord. And I like that sound a lot. So this would be the first few notes of a C major scale, followed by the top 3 notes of a C minor scale. We could analyze this as F melodic minor if we want to, but I just like thinking of it as this hybrid between C major and C minor. And this is a really cool sound. It gets used all over the place in film music and in jazz music. And in that little excerpt I played at the start of the video, I use it. So I hope this helps clear up some of these questions on what these black keys are doing in a song that's in the key of C major. And I also hope it gives you a little inspiration for how you can use non-diatonic notes and chords in your own songwriting. If anything here was confusing, I highly recommend checking out my other videos on numbers, scales, and chord symbols. It's likely you'll be able to find the answer there. My name is Ted with Piano Fluency. Thanks for joining me.